So good afternoon, everyone. I have the unique honor and privilege of introducing Patrick McCarthy. And before I formally introduce him, I actually want to share a personal story with you. And the personal story that I want to tell is about the work that I did more than a decade ago here in the city of Boston. So you all may recall this morning, we opened up our convening by hearing a young person, Carlos Barbosa, do spoken word for us. That young man is from a local community-based organization called Youth Opportunities Unlimited. And back when I did direct service work here more than a decade and a half ago, I worked at that nonprofit doing direct service. And my responsibilities in that role included going into the youth detention centers. So where youth are incarcerated in the state of Massachusetts. Here in Boston, I would go into those centers and teach young women basic literacy and numeracy skills. And I did that work for a couple of years. And the thing that hurt my heart the most was that over time, I began to lose track of, I could no longer count the number of young women who would say to me, Miss Monique, I need you to teach me how to read, because the dream that I have in my heart is to be able to read to my unborn baby. And as I mentioned, I lost track of the number of young women who asked me this question, because I realized over time that what was actually happening to these young women was that the Justice Center, these detention centers, had actually become a proxy for the education that these young women were not receiving. These basic literacy rights. And in preparing for these remarks today and thinking about what literacy means, I think about one of the quotes I once read that actually stayed in my heart, which is that literacy is inseparable from opportunity, and opportunity is inseparable from freedom. The freedom promised with literacy is both freedom from ignorance, from oppression, and it's both freedom to participate, to make choices, to access opportunity. And so in this work that I was doing with these young women, racing to give them these basic literacy skills, it really occurred to me that part of our work is to reform the justice system, the youth justice system. So when I introduce Patrick McCarthy, and he shares his vision for how we should close youth prisons across the United States, there really is a special place in my heart for this message, because I think of those young women. And I not only think of what I hoped in my heart they would be able to go on in their own lives and be able to do, but I very specifically think of their young children. And that when we serve them, we know that we are serving their young children, and hopefully in that way disrupting multi-generational poverty. So with that frame, I want to share with you that Patrick McCarthy joined the Annie E. Casey Foundation in 1994 to manage its mental health initiative for urban children. It was a 5-year, $20 million effort to provide high-quality, community-based mental health services for children in 4 high-poverty communities. With a career serving in multiple capacities in the mental health and human services fields, Mr. McCarthy brought to Casey a broad perspective on what children, families, and systems need to prosper. Throughout his tenure, he has led efforts to improve human services practices and policies to boost positive results for our nation's most vulnerable children and families. He held positions of increasing responsibility before officially being promoted to the president of the foundation in 2010. And before joining the Annie E. Casey Foundation, he held positions ranging from psychiatric social worker and head of school for youth with emotional and behavioral challenges to university professor and division director at the Delaware Department of Services for Children, Youth, and their Families. Please join me in giving Mr. Patrick McCarthy a warm welcome to the Aspen family.
Well, good afternoon. I was in a meeting in New York, a couple different meetings over the last few weeks, And as I was walking to catch the train at Penn Station, those of you who know New York realize that Madison Square Garden sits on top of the Amtrak station. And the last couple of weeks when I've been up there, there have been crowds and crowds of young people who had just graduated, caps and gowns, pictures, smiles, and photographs. And it really, this time of year right now is really, for many young people and their families, a season of celebration and optimism and hope. And sadly, for many other families and young people, it is a season of disappointment and pain and despair. Because rather than seeing their child graduate, they're seeing their child's life being lost or his life drifting away and opportunities being closed off. So I know I'm coming at the end of a very long afternoon. You've been working hard, and I know you have several sessions yet to go, so I very much appreciate the invitation, and I'm very grateful for you pretending to be attentive as I share some thoughts with you. It is, in all seriousness, heartening to see the progress that this movement has made in a relatively short time to help all young people find a path to opportunity. Our youth and our communities, our country, our future really depends on you. It depends on your success in enabling all young people to find connection to opportunity and success. So I want to talk to you about shutting off one of the worst pipelines to disconnection, a pipeline that leads to the kind of anguish and anger that too many families and young people are feeling today. I want to talk about an opportunity to fundamentally and completely rethink our approach to juvenile justice. And as a key objective, one key part of that is to close every last youth prison in the country. Now, I don't only believe that this is the right thing to do, I think we can do it, and that now is the right time. There is no more reliable feeder system to disconnection than our current approach, which is made up of all off-ramps and barriers and no on-ramps nor opportunities. But again, let's focus on youth prisons. Now, they go by a lot of different names. When I was a kid, we called them reformatories in the training school. Sometimes they're called youth development centers or youth rehabilitation centers. But let's be clear, what I'm talking about are those locked institutions that in all but name resemble and mimic an adult prison. That's what I'm talking about. Now, many of you may have been inside one of these places, and many of you may not have had that privilege. I will tell you that when, in a somewhat panicked call that I got from the secretary of our department asking me to step in temporarily to hold the youth rehab system together in my state, I had not been inside the facility that I was now responsible for. So let me give you a sense of what I saw when I walked in. I saw more than 100 teenagers in a building that had been built for 40, with bright, glaring lights everywhere that I looked. I heard a constant barrage of noise that reverberated off all the hard surfaces. I saw kids in sweats, many of those sweats with holes in them. I saw kids in shackles and handcuffs. I saw a mace on the belt of the guards. I saw a row of isolation rooms with everyone with a young boy in solitary confinement staring out of a narrow window. The walls were virtually dripping with a sense of pervasive stress, with fear, anger, and tension and a sense of imminent violence. How did we get here? How did we get to this place? Well, the answer, of course, is not simple, but in some ways it is part and parcel of what we've allowed ourselves to become. We've allowed ourselves to tell ourselves scary stories about our young people, and especially our young people of color, and especially our young black children, and we reinforce them daily. This youth prison, the rise in the youth prison population went hand in glove with professors and commentators and presidents and governors talking about a wave of super predators with no conscience foretelling rampant and escalating violence in the early 90s. Now, what I saw and heard that day, and by the way, these aren't pictures from 25, 30 years ago. These are pictures from last year. What I saw and heard that day and the things that I smelled, the things that I felt have never left me. It's haunted me ever since. And all of my experience since then has reinforced this basic conclusion that it really is time to simply close them down. It's long past time, and it's also time because we have the opportunity to finally close every last one of these facilities and replace them with a system that works. Now, I want to just lay out the case for why we should do this, and then I want to talk about how we should do this and why this is the right time. The public wants some very specific things from our juvenile justice system. They want community safety. They want young people to be held accountable, but to also have opportunities to get their lives back on track. Now, it's very interesting if you look at the polling and focus groups, the general public doesn't react so much to the cost, which I find very interesting. Their perspective is, I don't care what it costs if it works. However, policymakers care a lot about what it costs, and we all should care a lot about what it costs. So how do youth prisons stack up against what the public reasonably wants? Well, we know that youth prisons don't improve public safety. The recidivism rates are 70 to 80% or higher, and recent studies suggest that actually being incarcerated predicts young people getting in even more trouble when they are released. Being incarcerated doesn't help kids. It doesn't teach them a lesson. Rather, it pushes them farther off the pathway to success by telling them in 100 different ways that they are at the same time worthless and without hope, and yet dangerous and to be feared. They are less likely to be employed as adults, less likely to complete a post-secondary credential of any type, or even a high school degree. They're more likely to become addicted to drugs, more likely to become mentally ill, and less likely to form a stable family. Now, again, the public doesn't care so much about the cost, apparently, at least the folks we talk to. Policymakers do. We spend a ton of money to get these results. Between $85,000 and $250,000 a year to incarcerate a young person. Money that we need to do other things than lock kids in cages. Now, you all have spent your career working on behalf of young people, and I suspect there are even a few folks here who once upon a time, were a young person. So you know a lot about what young people need, and you know a lot about their development. So you can easily see why these prisons are such an exact mismatch for what kids actually need for their social, their mental, their educational, and their neurological development. These may have been well-intentioned institutions when they were first created more than 150 years ago, but given what we now know, they are almost perfectly designed factories of failure. So, we know that young people are heavily influenced by their peers. In fact, one of the strongest predictors of delinquent behavior is having a social circle that's dominated by delinquent peers. So youth prisons create intense relationships among peers, and all of those peers have a history of breaking the law. So rather than becoming schools for reform, they not only become schools for crime, they become formers of an identity that leads young people down the wrong path. We know that young people, especially when they're in trouble, need positive interactions with supportive adults to help them build self-esteem and self-confidence. Youth prisons instead pit youth against adults in a constant and escalating struggle over power and control. That's how they are set up. We know much more today about adolescent brain development than we did 150 years ago. We know that young people need opportunities to develop impulse control, to develop judgment and orientation toward the future and emotional maturity. And we know they do that by making mistakes and learning from them, and then realizing that they can do better, realizing that they may make a bad choice, but that doesn't mean that they are irredeemable and that they are a fundamentally bad person. Youth prisons, again, in 100 different ways, reinforce the most negative possible aspects of the young person's developing sense of self and character. We know much more than we knew 150 years ago about adverse childhood experiences, about stress, about trauma, and about triggers. And we know that most incarcerated young people have histories of severe trauma and certainly adverse childhood experiences, and that makes them especially sensitive to environmental triggers. Youth prisons are rampant with triggers for anger, for acting out, for aggression, and depression, things like isolation and solitary confinement, a trigger. Chemical and physical restraints, a trigger. The sterility of the environment itself, the bright lights, the constant noise, triggers. The inherent struggle between correctional officers and kids and the constant and pervasive threat of violence, more triggers. Again, thanks to our decades and decades, in fact, centuries of persistent racism, we know that all of this falls disproportionately on kids of color. Youth prisons perpetuate our society's deeply ingrained ways of depriving youth of color of opportunity. This chart shows the rate of incarceration per 100,000 for young people. Now, the rates for all groups are too high, but the rates for African American young people are more than 5 times the incarceration rate for white kids. A recent study of probation officers gives us a little bit of a sense of the reason for why this happens. They, in this study, interpreted the exact same behavior of a young person of color differently from a white young person. In black kids, they see acting out behavior as part of their attitude, part of their personality traits, who they essentially are. They see the same behavior in white kids as resulting from external issues beyond their control. Now, to be clear, this is not because they are probation officers, and it's not because they are any more or any less conditioned by racism than every one of us in this country, but because we continue to allow racist narratives to underpin our juvenile justice system, our response to adolescent misbehavior, it ends up with these kinds of results. It's perhaps no surprise, given all that I've said so far, that in addition to the harm that is done in a day in, day out kind of basis, we also find that abuse in these facilities is rampant. It was as if they were built into the very walls of these places. This is a chart that shows the data, the shameful data that confirms what you would expect and what our worst fears would be. Serious abuse, sexual assaults, unbridled use of solitary confinement have been documented in 30 states in the last decade. And the darker shades there, those are the shades where it's been documented since 2011. 30 states. Now, I'm often asked, and I asked myself when I was responsible for one of these facilities, I'm often asked whether, well, why can't we just fix these places? Let's just make them better. Make them less abusive and less harmful. And I used to think that I could do that. I tried, and I suspect there are others in this audience who've tried as well. Jerry Miller was a leader in Massachusetts who tried to change the facilities in Massachusetts and concluded that it was impossible, concluded that they could not be changed. And so he worked to actually close the youth prisons, and he said it very well. That leads us to conclude that we need a coordinated and well-sequenced and a comprehensive approach to close youth prisons. It includes many of the community-based programs and approaches and reforms you've talked about at previous gatherings. But again, remember that these facilities themselves exert such gravitational pull that just setting up alternative programs is not going to lead them to close. They will suck our young people into them, and they will continue to fill, they will continue to fail, and they will continue to harm our kids. We have an opportunity moment right now to finally close every last one of these places. We have greater public support than we've ever had. We have political support. The politics actually work, and we know what to do, as a number of states and cities have taken steps along this path. Just in recent weeks, in May, Rand Paul came out with this quote. He and Patrick Leahy and others are co-sponsoring a bill to counteract some of the harshly punitive and incarceration-focused rhetoric coming out of the Department of Justice in the last couple of months in a bipartisan kind of a way. We see Newt Gingrich a year ago with a similar kind of a quote. Now, one of the reasons why politicians are actually beginning to talk like this on both sides of the aisle is that they know what the public wants to see. We did some public polling with the Casey Foundation. Youth First did public polling. The Pew Foundation did, Pew Charitable Trust did public polling. All told us the same things. The general public wants to see young people held accountable. They want their communities to be safe, but they also want young people to have a chance to get their lives back on track. And this included focus groups with folks who had been victims of juvenile crime themselves. So what we need to do is the 3 R's. We need to reduce, we need to reform, and we need to replace. Just a moment on each. Reduce. One of the reasons why we can be optimistic that we can actually do this is that right now we have already reduced the pipeline quite a bit, by 45% since the mid-90s. So the pipeline is not, the facilities are not as full as they used to be. And even now, even with that reduction, we find that over half of the young people in youth prisons today are not there because of a violent offense. They're there for a non-violent offense. And another 17% were there only because of a technical violation of parole or probation. This is doable. We can reduce the pipeline even more. Perhaps the hardest thing, and this is where your leadership is going to be really critical, we need a fundamental paradigm shift in our juvenile justice system. We need to have the entire system focused on the singular mission of getting youth back on track, helping them master the developmental milestones and to acquire the skills and the experience and relationships that they need that'll set them up for success. That means changes to the culture in the juvenile justice systems, changing how they're put together, where the money flows to, and how the incentives work from the state to the local level, and changing how decisions are made. This is really hard work. This is where we need everybody's help. And finally, the replace. I have two older brothers, but my oldest brother, is someone I've always looked up to, so I was, of course, excited to tell him that I had the opportunity to do a TEDx talk, and he asked me what it was about, and I told him, and he gave me that older brother look, and he said, it was sort of like, have you not grown up yet? Have I taught you nothing? He said, you can't just close every youth prison in the country. That's never going to work. He's absolutely right. There are young people who will need a period of secure care. There's no question about that. But just because a young person needs some period of secure placement for the protection of the community while we intervene in that young person's life does not justify the harsh, punitive, prison-like environments that we see them in right now. We know enough to know that there are secure programs that can be smaller, closer to home, that focus on turning lives around and equipping young people to succeed when they leave those facilities. Again, these are not harebrained schemes. There are places all over the country that are making progress on this. Missouri was a pioneer in replacing their youth prisons a good 30 years ago. I was part of the cohort of youth correctional leaders who met regularly to talk about how to bring about reform, and Mark Stewart at the time was just starting this work, and here it is 30 years later. There's not a single youth prison in Missouri. They've chosen smaller programs. They have a philosophy they call eyes on, ears on, hearts on. And that's how they train their staff, and they build a normative culture so they don't need these kinds of harsh, punitive approaches. Places like New York City, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Texas, Ohio, and others have very promising reforms underway and have closed many of their youth prisons. This is a secure facility in Missouri. This is the kind of furniture and relationship that they have. Now, here comes the ask. I can't think of a room full of people in the entire country that is more knowledgeable, better connected, or has a bigger stake in helping to close down these factories of failure. I'm asking you to put some of your skills and your experience, your energy, your relationships, and your passion into this campaign. You can help lift up and amplify the voices of young people. We have a cohort of young people who are directing this work at the foundation, and they are powerful. I promise you, any one of them would do a much better job standing up here than I would. Next year, get them up here, because they'll tell you what it's like. You can help lift up their voices. You can help lift up the voices of families, of communities that are bearing the brunt of these failed policies, and they can be some of the most powerful and effective advocates you will ever see. You can help educate the stakeholders around your collective impact tables about the way these institutions derail kids and why the time has come to close them down and replace them with something that works and gets kids back on track. There are existing coalitions already at work. Youth First is active in 5 states, and they intend to spread beyond that. You can join one of those coalitions and help pushing it forward. Now, I know that I'm talking to people who know day in and day out how hard it is to change a system so that it works better for kids. It is incredibly difficult, painstaking, sometimes tedious, sometimes heartbreaking work. You know what it takes to shift these deeply ingrained beliefs and behaviors and habits. You know how hard it is. But I will tell you what is really hard to contemplate. Today, while some families are celebrating their graduates, somewhere there's a parent watching her precious child be placed in the back of a van that will take him across state to be locked away in a youth prison. And she knows how vulnerable he is. We can only imagine how worried she is for his safety and fearing for his future. I believe the most important test we have for whether a policy makes sense is whether we would want our own child, if our own child was in that circumstance, to have that experience. I've never met anyone who said, yeah, I want to see my child locked up in one of these youth prisons. Working together, we can help ensure that no parent has to experience what that mom might be experiencing today, but rather we can make sure that she can watch him walk across the stage to collect that diploma or head out to the door excited about a new job that he has. I predict that 25 years from now, those who follow us will ask us, why did it take so long? The time is now to close youth prisons. It's been a long time in coming. It's a fiscal, moral, social, and political imperative. And we can do it. Thank you.
One second. Just thank you, Patrick. And so we literally, well, let me ask you. We were gonna do one. Do you stand with Patrick on this? Do you stand with him? If you do, stand with him. Thank you. And I just want to say, it seems trite and inappropriate to give you this somewhat goofy gift, but we're going to do it in light of like the heavy and a very, very important message you just delivered to our network. But you know me, I'm going to do it anyway. And you may have heard about this already because I'm sure it's out in the Twittersphere.
I'm now terrified.
No, it's all good. And I'm certain there will be copycats on eBay within the next couple of hours of our unofficial conference T-shirt. But the way it goes is, you probably know that Deval Patrick kicked it off.
Yeah.
You are now dead center in the middle, Patrick. And tomorrow we're closing with Patrick Gaspard.
Oh, I thought Steve Patrick. No?
No, Steve Patrick plays his bit role. Yeah, but we did realize that the theme of the conference is never doubt a small group of Patricks can change the world. So it is our great pleasure to present you with the unofficial T-shirt.
This is great.
And to thank you for your leadership and all you're doing.
Thank you,
And we
everybody.
stand with you.
Thank you, Steve.
I don't know if there's any announcements before Patrick and I walk up the stage. Moni?
So consultancies are starting. You're on your own about town for Boston for dinner tonight. We hope that you have a wonderful time. Reminder that there's a leaders dinner beginning at 7:45. We'll see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. when we co-convene with the Collective Impact Forum. Thank you all for being in with us today.
Thank you, Steve. This is so sweet.
In front of our network.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, you got it.